The year is 1989. We are focusing on Eastern Europe, and there is a wind of change in the air. The Iron Curtain is falling, the Soviet Union is collapsing, and several nations are darting towards independence and freedom from the influence of the Soviet Union. In total, 15 new nations will emerge from the collapse of the Soviet Union, being nations that will, over time, diverge and set out on vastly different paths, often towards the west, either peacefully, via conflict, or remaining within the orbit of the now successor of the Soviet Union, Russia. We see in Europe a majority of newly independent states beginning to move towards the orbit of the west, via EU and NATO membership. One nation, however, has an administration that has largely stayed loyal to its previous sphere of influence. That nation is the country of Belarus. Why did Belarus remain loyal towards Russia? Why did this country reject the notion of moving westwards? And why did this nation stand as largely an outlier in this part of the world for its position towards Russia? Let's explore this phenomenon by starting at the forefront of Belarusian independence in 1991. The independence of Belarus in 1991 represents only the second time that a Belarusian nation-state has ever existed, with the only other time being during the chaos that followed World War I, which allowed for the creation of the Belarusian Democratic Republic. Despite only lasting a year before once again being under the influence of Russia, this brief republic gave rise to some of the most prominent Belarusian independence symbols, such as the coat of arms and the flag, which is still used today in anti-government protests in Belarus, which we will discuss later. Anyways, back to 1991, Belarus is independent, but like most of the rest of the former Soviet Union, the country's economy is in shambles. Belarus was known as a producer of machinery and equipment within the Soviet Union. Factories in cities like Minsk, Gomel and Mogilev produced tractors, automobiles and heavy machinery, which were major industries in the country. Belarus was also a major producer of automobiles, with the company Belaz being one of the largest producers of automobiles in the Soviet Union, being based in the city of Zalzina. Agriculture, petrochemicals and textiles were also large industries in Belarus during the Soviet Union era. Factories in Belarus often produced components and machinery that were part of a larger distribution network across the Soviet Union. The dissolution of the Soviet Union disrupted established supply chains, which led to production halts and economic instability in Belarus. Economic activities were directed by central planning from Moscow during the Soviet Union era, with production targets and resource allocations determined also by the Soviet authorities. The transition from a centrally planned economy to a market-oriented system was challenging. Belarus faced the task of reorienting its economy while dealing with the loss of Soviet markets and subsidies. On top of this, the introduction of a new currency, the Belarusian ruble, resulted in the country having a weaker currency, not conducive to the exportation of high-value products, which ultimately resulted in hyperinflation running rampant in the country post-independence. This atmosphere made it difficult for the newly independent government to garner mass enthusiasm surrounding its policies, which provided fervent ground for a previously largely unknown figure to emerge in the next election. This man is Alexander Lukashenko. Lukashenko, a former collective farm director, manages to portray himself as a man of the people figure, promising to crack down on corruption and to tackle Belarus's numerous economic struggles. His populist-style promises appeal to a voter base frustrated with the economic collapse of the Belarusian economy and the fall of living standards post-independence. Lukashenko secures a massive 80% victory in the 1994 election over the first post-independent prime minister, Mr. Yakislav Kivich. The elections were the first and only regarded free elections in Belarus after independence. Once in power, Lukashenko moves towards what I consider to be the most consequential vote that has resulted in the current state of Belarus, that being a referendum in 1995 which asks 4 questions to the electorate. The first question asks, do you agree that Russian should have the same status as the Belarusian language? Even by this time, Russian was established as a language of daily life across most of Belarus. The second question asks, do you support the actions of the president aimed at economic integration with Russia? The third question asks, do you support the suggestion about the introduction of a new state flag and state coat of arms of the Republic of Belarus? This saw the removal of the previously mentioned independence flag and coat of arms of Belarus established during the brief period of independence post-World War I into the symbols we see today, which are much more closely related to the Soviet-era symbols of the country. The final and most consequential referendum question saw public approval to grant the president the power to dissolve the Supreme Soviet, or the parliament, if it was found to be a systematic or gross violation of the constitution. This will significantly increase the president's power over the legislative branch. The referendum itself saw a turnout of 64.8%, with a total of 70% plus approval for each question. This happened amidst the backdrop of a political crackdown on the opposition parties of the country, with the referendum being seen as a sham by many international observers. Still, the 1995 referendum was a turning point in Belarusian history, with long-lasting effects on the country's political system, linguistic policies, and cultural identity. The results facilitated Alexander Lukashenko's consolidation of power and marked the beginning of his long-term authoritarian rule of the country. Belarus moved closer to the Russian orbit, although the country was already heavily dependent on Russia for energy supplies. Russia is also the country's main trading partner, which emphasized the importance of Lukashenko to move closer to the Russian sphere of influence. Lukashenko, whose government moved further towards authoritarianism, also received far less pushback from Russia than it would from Western organizations, which only naturally made Russia a preferable partner for the Lukashenko government in its bid to consolidate its grip over Belarus. Throughout the 90s, relations remained strong between Russia and Belarus, culminating in the signing of a Union State Treaty in 1999. This treaty effectively would merge both Russia and Belarus into a union under one president. However, Lukashenko, who by all accounts fancied himself as the new leader of this union, began to backtrack on this treaty due to the rise of Vladimir Putin in Russia, which effectively curtailed any chance of Lukashenko also getting power over Russia. The Freedom March by those opposing the treaty in Belarus also played a pivotal role in Lukashenko backing down on Belarus's commitments towards a union with Russia, although the poorer economy of Belarus would be, and still is today, tied to Russia. As we enter into the 2000s, we begin to see some important flashpoints in the relations between Belarus and Russia. Russia at times began leveraging its vast energy supplies that it provides to Belarus to ensure that the country remained favorable to its sphere of influence. For example, in 2004, a payment dispute resulted in Russia cutting off all gas supplies to Belarus. In early 2004, Russia's state-controlled gas company, Gazprom, demanded that Belarus pay higher prices for its natural gas, moving from heavily subsidized rates closer to market levels. The price was proposed to increase from $30 per 1,000 cubic meters to $50 per 1,000 cubic meters. Belarus in turn wanted to increase the transit fees for Russian gas transported through its territory to the rest of Europe. After failed negotiations, Gazprom briefly cut off all gas supplies to Belarus in February 2004, which caused mass disruptions in the country. The supply was only restored after Belarus agreed to pay the price increase. Another dispute arose in 2007, where Gazprom once again demanded a significant increase in gas prices from $47 per 1,000 cubic meters to $100 per 1,000 cubic meters, to be in line with the price that Western markets were paying. A critical part of the resolution of this dispute involved Gazprom securing a 50% stake in Beltransgas, the Belarusian state gas company, over 4 years. The deal was valued at $2.5 billion. Both disputes highlighted Belarus's economic dependency on Russia for energy supplies and the use of energy as a tool of political leverage by the Russian government. There was also the so-called Milk War between Belarus and Russia. The Milk War between Belarus and Russia refers to a series of trade disputes that primarily took place in 2009. The conflict began when Russia's Federal Service for Veterinary and Psychosanitary Surveillance imposed a ban on the importation of certain Belarusian dairy products, citing non-compliance with Russian quality and safety standards. This was after Belarus began to move towards aligning with EU standards. Russia, being by far the largest market for Belarusian milk and other dairy products, leveraged this market position to ban around 1,200 types of Belarusian dairy products. This was a substantial economic blow to Belarus, as dairy product exports to Russia were a major revenue source. Many analysts suggested that Russia did this as a response to Belarus becoming slightly more friendly with the EU at the time. Still, this dispute was resolved, but again demonstrated the economic power that Russia held over Belarus. For the EU's part, there was some increasing engagement with Belarus, particularly as the bloc expanded eastward. However, the authoritarian of Lukashenko kept getting in the way of any meaningful progress towards enhanced economic and political ties. In 2014, Russia occupied Crimea, and the Donbass conflict begins. Belarus to this day formally does not recognize the annexation as legitimate. However, Lukashenko has acknowledged that Russia is in control of Crimea on several occasions. This begins a period of seismic shifts across Europe as new allegiances are drawn as a result of the conflict. Belarus remained largely neutral in the conflict in an effort to balance relations between Ukraine and Russia. Belarus also begins to enact some moves towards a more independent relationship with Russia, which includes promoting the use of the Belarusian language and diversifying its economy away from reliance on Russia. There were also brief periods of thaw in their relations with the West, particularly when Belarus released some political prisoners and engaged in dialogue with the EU, which resulted in the temporary lifting of some sanctions. However, by 2020, everything changed. In this year, Belarus holds its presidential election. It is the 6th time that Lukashenko has gone to the polls, and typically he has always won by a landslide. Although, to be fair, the elections are generally viewed by most analysts to be unfair. In 2020, his political opponent is activist Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, She has led the political opposition to his authoritarian rule through an oppositional government operating from Lithuania and Poland. Tikhanovskaya became an opposition leader after her husband, Serhiy Tikhanovsky, ran as a presidential candidate. He gets arrested, along with most other opposition leaders in Belarus, leaving his wife to run in his place. The Central Election Commission announced that Lukashenko won the vote with 80% of the vote, while Tikhanovskaya received only 10%. These results were viewed widely as fraudulent. Reports of widespread electoral fraud, including ballot stuffing and a lack of transparency, fueled skepticism and anger among the populace. On election night, spontaneous protests erupted across Belarus. Demonstrators clashed with security forces who responded with tear gas, rubber bullets, and stun grenades. Under pressure and fearing for her safety, Tikhanovskaya fled to Lithuania shortly after the election, where she continued to call for peaceful protests and new elections. The days and weeks following the election saw unprecedented mass demonstrations, with hundreds and thousands of people participating in protests, especially in the capital Minsk. Russia quickly recognized the official results of the presidential election, legitimizing Alexander Lukashenko's victory despite widespread allegations of fraud. Russia provided significant financial assistance to Belarus during the crisis. In September 2020, Russia agreed to extend a $1.5 billion loan to Belarus, helping to stabilize the Belarusian economy amid sanctions and internal turmoil. Russia maintained its energy subsidies, particularly in the supply of natural gas and oil, which are crucial to the Belarusian economy. The economic lifeline was essential for Lukashenko's regime. Additional EU sanctions were placed on Belarus, and Belarus, under the leadership of Lukashenko, who was even more grateful for Putin's help with the protests, moves firmly within the sphere of influence of Russia, which ultimately leads to Belarus providing logistical and territorial support to Russia during the 2022 invasion of Ukraine. Belarusian territory was used as a staging ground for Russian troops, further aligning Belarus with Russia's strategic interest. Belarus's involvement in the Ukraine conflict, even indirectly, led to further international isolation and sanctions, which increases its reliance on Russia for economic and political support. It will be increasingly even more difficult for the country to move away from Russia's orbit in the near future. And there we have it, a brief overview as to why Belarus remains within the Russian sphere of influence. A shared history, combined with the economic and now political leverage that Russia holds over Belarus, coupled with the authoritarian nature of Lukashenko, have all been the primary reasons as to why this country has not embraced the West in the same manner that some of its neighbours have. As always, we're interested to see alternative viewpoints in the comments, so please let us know them, and consider subscribing to this very small channel. Thank you.